for the School of Communications online virtual event titled Ongoing Attacks on Democracy, the State of Far-Right Extremism in America. I am happy to present Dean Sam Fullwood. Sam, you can take it away.
Thank you, Kati. I'm very happy to be here this evening to explore this very important topic, which I'm not going to get too in-depth on it because we have an excellent panel that's going to go in depth on this subject. But I did want to take a few minutes to say a couple of things. First off, it's really exciting for us to be able to be back together in such a way that we can have these conversations about important topics. The School of Communication and the School of Public Affairs at American University feels that these kinds of things are just critical to our mission of informing people, educating students, and providing a service to our larger community. If there's one bright spot about COVID, it's that we've been able to continue to have these kinds of important conversations and to have them in a medium where we can attract large numbers of people. So I thank you all for being here this evening. This topic about extremism in America is very, very important to both of our schools, both the School of Communication and the School of Public Affairs. I came to American University largely because I was concerned about how our democracy is progressing. We are at an inflection point, and the extremist behavior of some in our midst, not only in the United States, but around the world, is a very, very serious issue. And we want to explore that. We want to have honest, frank conversations and see if we can find solutions that average Americans can be engaged in dealing with this. I'm very, very proud of the panel that we have. I'm going to cite Kurt Braddock, who is an assistant professor in the School of Communication, who's going to lead our conversation. Kurt and I have talked about some of these issues, and I am looking forward to this conversation tonight. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay the whole time, but I will definitely be watching on the recording of this. So if without any more ado, I'm going to turn over to Kurt. Take it away, Kurt.
Dean Fullwood, thanks very much for the nice introduction, and thank you to everybody in the room here to listen to the roundtable discussion. I was just kind of flipping through the participants in the room, and I see a lot of familiar names there. So hello to everybody who knows me, and hello to everybody who doesn't know me. Hopefully you'll get to know me, Brian, and Cynthia a bit more as we go through this talk here today. The basis of this conversation, and the conversation we're going to have today is going to be very much like the conversations that I have with some of my colleagues in the SOC and the kinds of conversations that I have with Cynthia and Brian every day, just walking around the office. Of course, we focus primarily on the research that we do, but we also have these more informal type discussions about the state of the nation and what drives the research that we do. And I think that's kind of the direction we're going to go with this discussion here today. Most primarily, we were interested in how democracy has been threatened by those actors who seek to undermine some of the principles that really drive what many believe America is meant to be. And we're going to dig into some of these concepts, which are going to be politically charged just by their very nature. And we hope to tease out some of the ideas that underpin some of the violence that we've seen and some of the others who have supported the violence that we've seen. So I thought first, before we dive too deep, we take our time to introduce ourselves, since you saw presumably the flyer and Dean Fullwood's introduction, but you don't know us terribly well. I'm Kurt Braddock. Many of you, like I said, know me. I'm assistant professor in the School of Communication, and there I study the ways that language and words affect radicalization processes and how language can be used to counter radicalization processes. I'm primarily concerned with the ways that propaganda and different kinds of messaging affect people psychologically and get them to move to a point where they're willing to engage in violence on behalf of their political ideology. I am also, and Cynthia will smile every time I say this, I'm also a faculty fellow at PERIL, the Polarization, Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, where I think, I say this every time, I think it's an official title, but I'm not sure. It's on my door plate. It says I'm senior methodologist, which basically means I enjoy doing statistics in the research that I do. So let me pass it off to Cynthia here next. And Cynthia, if you'd introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Kurt, for the invitation to be here, and to the School of Communication and the School of Public Affairs for hosting the event. I'm Cynthia Miller-Idriss. I'm a sociologist by training. I hold a joint appointment in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education here as a professor. And I'm also the co-founder and director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL. So my own individual research, I'm a cultural sociologist. I study symbols and youth culture, communication systems and sign systems, historically through iconography, graffiti, t-shirts, memes, youth culture, other kinds of elements like that. And I've been working mostly in Germany and Europe for the first 20 years of my career or so, until about the last 4 or 5 years, when I've been getting more drawn into US and domestic based issues. So I do a lot of public facing work now. Some of you will have been in some of those talks or testimonies or briefings, et cetera. And I look forward to your questions and your answers. I will just, and the questions and answers that Kurt and Brian provide. I'll just say really quickly that the lab itself focuses on interventions across the ideological spectrum. We look at disinformation, propaganda, persuasive extremist sort of tactics, and how to interrupt them. But my research personally focuses on the far right. And so I'll be going back and forth between my own researcher hat and the director of the lab, where we have a much broader range of projects. Brian.
Thanks, Cynthia. Brian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us here tonight, and for allowing me to speak with you. My name is Dr. Brian Hughes. I'm a research assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs, and I'm the co-founder and associate director of PERIL. I'm also a graduate of the School of Communication, where I completed my PhD with Dr. Rhonda Zaharna. I also look at digital communication technologies and their interaction with political and religious extremism and fringe cultures. So the ways that fringe cultures and extremist movements and individuals use communication technology, particularly digital communication technology, but then also the ways that the affordances of digital communication technology shape the outlooks and the operational styles, and even the sort of sense of identity and selfhood that these extremist groups develop and evolve over time. I'll just add to what Cynthia said about PERIL. PERIL really works hard to distinguish itself in this space through its mission and its values. We are committed to work that centers the needs of victims and survivors. And while, of course, we understand that law enforcement and security are essential, and probably more essential than ever nowadays, that's not the only solution, and that there are preventative and community resilience building strategies that need to be developed so that we can avoid carceral solutions, so we can develop communities where extremism, hate, and so on don't have the same fertile ground out of which to grow. So those are the things that we really look at PERIL. I guess I'll leave it at that. Looking forward to getting this talk going.
Thanks, Brian. So you can see we have a couple of experts from PERIL, myself from communication, so hopefully we'll cover a lot of ground here. Before we jump into the first question here, I want to just give you kind of the way this is going to work. This will be a discussion. I have several question type prompts that we're going to go through related to the threats facing the United States. There is no formal, just I'm going to ask and Cynthia will answer, and I'm going to ask and then Brian will answer. This is meant to be a roundtable where we bounce ideas off of each other and more or less discuss the state of what's going on in the US. So if it seems a bit more informal than you were expecting, I hope you appreciate that sort of show. Another thing that I want to make sure everybody knows is that we are going to probably talk until I think we said about 7:30, at which point we will turn directly to Q&A. That said, that doesn't mean you can't throw questions in the Q&A while we're talking. We will be monitoring that. And when a question does appear that we feel that we can answer in the midst of the conversation, we'll try to do that. But aside from that, we will also be doing purely Q&A at the end of the discussion. So with that, if I could, let me turn to kind of my first prompt here. And it's relatively general. And this is really to both of you. What are your impressions of the threats facing the United States right now? And Cynthia was very clear to say that she's focused on the far right, although PERIL and I look at ideologies across the political spectrum. I think most people would argue that the greatest threat facing the United States at present, domestically, is the far right and the various instantiations of it. So what are your impressions of the far right in the United States right now? And do you think that the far right poses the threat that we've heard about to domestic security in the US? And what does that mean for US democratic ideals? We've seen elements of the far right challenge some of those ideals, especially since January 6th. So just very generally, what are your impressions of what the far right is right now and what they're doing? I'll start with Cynthia.
Only a really basic question, right? Like that's a huge, we could talk about that the whole time, but good question. I mean, there are a couple things. One, I just want to unpack the term far right by saying that there is no universally agreed upon language to refer to this set of threats. It's one of the most ridiculous situations that we're in this country and globally is that not even our own agencies are using the same term. So I use the term far right. I call it the best bad term we have available, but it really is a bad term. So
I want to jump in real quick too, Cynthia, just so people know that if you're not familiar with terrorism studies, this is not unique to the right wing. Every term is argued over and argued over and argued over. And what we consider the far or the extreme right is no different. So I don't want you to think, the audience, to think there's anything special about the far right.
Nothing special, although I would say it's particularly bad on the far right spectrum when we don't even have, we have really different terms. Like there's really no agreement in the agencies. I'll just explain that in a minute. But when I use the term far right, I'm really referring to two broad types of things. One are supremacist movements. That is historically and most dominantly white supremacist extremist movements, but also male supremacist extremism, Western supremacism, Christian supremacism, right? Movements that dehumanize, that set up hierarchies of superiority and inferiority that pose the other as a threat, an existential threat that often then leads to violence. The other set of far right kinds of threats generally is anti-democratic or anti-government, sometimes movements that are unlawful militias typically, but others, secessionist movements, sovereign citizens, those kinds of threats, which are pretty uniquely US. There are sovereign citizen movements elsewhere, but that is a much bigger set of issues here in the US than in most other places. You have some in Canada we're seeing right now. And then there's a few other things that are kind of like single issue extremists, like anti-abortion extremists. But the Justice Department now is referring to domestic violent extremism as one overarching umbrella. That includes some stuff on the left, like anarchists, extremism, anti-fascist, so Antifa groups, and also animal rights and environmental extremists. That's not part of the far right, that's part of the far left. So anyway, those sometimes get collapsed under DVE or domestic violent extremism. So you sort of see that tension. So there's, generally speaking, three major categories of threat on the terrorism and extremism side. There's the far left, there's the far right, and there's Islamist or jihadi, Salafi jihadi extremism. Numerically, statistically, right now, there's pretty strong agreement. I mean, very little disagreement across both the end of the Trump administration and the Biden administration now, and all the threat assessments in the recent 2 years, that domestic violent extremism is the biggest threat, with white supremacist extremism and unlawful militia as being the top two threats, depending on whether you're targeting civilians or government officials. So I feel like the data is super clear. We can argue about that. It's not that there is no more threat from the left. It's not that there is no threat from jihadi, Salafi jihadi extremism. Those are all there. It's just that the FBI reports now 2,700 investigations on the domestic extremism side, up from 1,000 in 2017, a tripling on the white supremacist extremism side. So there's just on the propaganda, on the plots foiled, on the arrests, on the actual lethality, the pace and scale of that has increased here. I should say that in Europe, it is still jihadi extremism and terrorism. That's the biggest threat, but far-right extremism is growing quickly. And then globally, across the West, it's up 250% over the last 5 years. So big increases, but it's a muddled threat landscape. And I don't think we should take our eyes off of any particular threat. It's just a question of resources and where the biggest threat's coming from right now.
Yeah.
About yourself, Brian, you have that. Yeah.
When you were talking about, the definitions of things and agreements and disagreements, I was actually speaking with one of our research fellows today, and she informed me that there are 250 working definitions in use to define terrorism. So, as with just about any academic discipline, there's a lot of debate. And when you throw such a politically charged subject into the mix, it's only going to be more hotly debated. One of the things that I would just add to what Cynthia just said is that there is a pretty good definition of extremism that does tend to be used fairly consistently. It comes from the work of a scholar named J.M. Berger. And essentially, what it says is that extremism is when one group of people says that defines itself by an identity marker, and then it says that this in-group is in dire conflict with an out-group that has an opposing identity marker. So neo-Nazis and Jews, the Aryan race and Jews is the classic example. And that this antagonism, it can't be resolved. It has to be dealt with either through violence or expulsion or elimination, what have you. So that's one way that we think about extremism when it's separate from terrorism. The two aren't synonyms. Political violence can very frequently happen without any reference to extremist attitudes or ideologies. And at PERIL, we don't exclusively focus on terrorism. Terrorism is looked at very closely. Terrorism is something that gets a lot of attention from law enforcement, from our security apparatuses, from Congress and the president. The terroristic and the legal dimension of this really is looked at with a great deal of attention, and a lot of resources are rightly channeled towards dealing with that. But extremism can speak to something much broader and much deeper in the fabric of our everyday life. And I think in terms of doing some kind of a threat assessment of our everyday life, it isn't just about these spectacular incidents of violence that seem to erupt out of nowhere and cause all this trauma and grief. It's really about a chronic condition where extremist attitudes that we have one, core identity over here, and it's in conflict with this core identity over here. It's that more pervasive and chronic growth of extremist attitudes that is probably the most, concerning and troubling threat to the fabric of our society and the health of our democracy, at least as I see it.
I think it's also important to note that when we talk about, we throw these terms around quite a bit, and even academics and experts are guilty of using different terms to mean different things just in conversation. I think it's important to remember that many of the discussions surrounding prevention of violent extremism and addressing problems by the so-called far right, for lack of a better term, we base our efforts, or at least I know two of you base your efforts, and I base my efforts on stopping violent attitudes, beliefs, and intentions. We generally don't get in the business of trying to affect people's beliefs if they don't support violence. And I think that often gets kind of lost in the sauce. I mean, I know I get emails all the time from from people who ask me, well, why are you focused on this? I mean, are you trying to, excuse me, are you trying to stifle all conservative ideas? And no, not at all. The line is support for violence and the intention to engage in violence. But this also leads to another question, and we have both kind of touched upon it, or we've all kind of touched upon it a little bit. Cynthia, you mentioned there are other elements that do pose threats to U.S. domestic security. You have, I mean, I'm not an Islamist terrorism scholar, but we know that threat is still there. There are left-wing factions that have engaged in violence or at least threatened violence. But we focus our energies on the far right. What do you see as potential other threats to U.S. domestic security? And given that we focus on the far right generally, and by we, I mean right now the academic community, the security apparatus of the U.S., why do you think we focus on the far right so heavily?
Well, I think, I would add two things I want to add. One is that I would say in terms of what PERIL does, it's true that the government in general and researchers who focus on terrorism in particular and extremism are primarily focused on the prevention of violence. I would say that PERIL is a little bit different. We are interested in precursors to violence, in part because we situate our work not as focused on the fringe itself, but rather as equipping the mainstream with the tools to be resilient against the fringe. And so we do a lot of work that is in what would be called digital literacy or media literacy work to help people recognize what propaganda looks like, to help people understand what conspiracy theories look like, to prevent the persuasiveness of disinformation about vaccines. So things that are not necessarily directly tied to violence, but that I see as important to the public health of our nation, to our democratic stability. And so we do see it as democratic resilience, as building inclusive, resilient democracies, that's sort of what we're contributing to by looking at some of the negative stuff that comes from the fringe and situating our work within the mainstream. So we are really at PERIL. I want to say that is really different than how most people look at prevention of violent extremism. And in fact, when we talk about our work, we actually sometimes don't even think it fits within that world of prevention of violent extremism, but rather within the world of building inclusive democracies and building inclusive communities. So, I think we can talk about that all night, but I see it as those are two sides of the same coin. I mean, after World War II in Germany, the entire approach is called defensive democracy, which is that you cannot effectively combat the fringe by only looking at the fringe and only focusing on the fringe. You also have to build resilience in the mainstream. And that is essentially what we try to do, is work on a public health approach the same way that you would treat diabetes, not just by looking at the symptoms of the disease, but also by educating communities, even though they have the freedom to make whatever choices they want, that you make them more holistically aware of the options for their own behavioral and attitudinal choices if we teach people in communities about healthy eating habits and exercise habits that can prevent the incidence of disease. It's the same kind of thing. So I just want to say that because I think that's important, that we need a space that is focused on that type of approach. And most other countries do that as part of their prevention efforts. We do not, as a country, do that. And so a lot of what we're doing is outside of the frame of the traditional US approach and in a more community and related, and not federally government funded way, but from foundations and individual donors as a result. So in terms of other threats, the one thing I'll say is that I think it's really important to look at what Brian and I have written about as blurry or muddled ideologies, that I would say the biggest threats are coming in ways that are really hard to recognize, that there's no more clean ideological boundaries around movements or groups in quite the same way. So a lot of what we're seeing are things like ecofascism, which is the intersection of kind of far-right ideologies or white supremacist ideas, but justified with climate change and environmental sustainability, or far-right groups praising the Taliban, or white supremacist group that is calling for the liquidation of the capitalist classes, right? You see these kind of strange hybrid types of things that are a result of the way that people kind of pick and choose fragments of ideology that they encounter online and then reassemble them in new ways. And some people have called that salad bar terrorism. Some people have called that, like we do, blurry or muddled ideologies. But to me, that's the most likely kind of thing. And I have an op-ed coming out tomorrow about the Ottawa Protest. So everybody can read it at MSNBC, where I'm a columnist. So I write a lot of pieces for them. But, but that is arguing in part that what we're seeing is even something like that, which actually started as a peaceful protest, quickly devolve basically and get taken over by and infiltrated by and co-opted by a lot of extremist groups. And really, GoFundMe gets shut down as a result because it's no longer a peaceful protest. I mean, all these kinds of things happen, and it galvanizes the extreme right across the world. That happened really quickly. And I think we're going to see more and more of those kinds of things. Whether you agree with those truckers or not, the protest was intended to be peaceful. It quickly evolved into something else.
Yeah, and I'd like to circle back to this question of domestic security. When we talk about domestic security, we should always ask ourselves the question, what is it that we're securing? Is this just a question of averting a shooting or a bombing? What is the domestic that we actually want to preserve? Because right now there are many people with very dark political ambitions who hold these supremacist values, who hold anti-democratic values, but who are willing to use the apparatuses of democracy to obtain power. And if they obtain power, yeah, sure, maybe they could reduce the number of shootings and the number of bombings. Well, have we really succeeded in preserving our domestic security in that event? I don't think any of us would say that we had. So this is really about promoting and taking care of this value of democracy as a positive value that needs to be stood for. Working in this field can't simply be opposing whatever is illegal and fringe. There has to be a sort of positive value that animates the work. And for us, that's democracy. That's building a society where everyone feels as if they have a home and as if they have their share of influence over the way their lives are governed. And Cynthia, hit the nail on the head with just the emerging threat landscape and how complex and unpredictable it can be. And since this is the School of Communication, I'll jump on my comms guy hobby horse for just a minute and say that this is enabled, if not provoked, depending on how deterministic you want to be, by the digital communication technologies and the way that they're designed and engineered that have emerged over the past few decades. In the good old days, a person who is vulnerable to recruitment, to extremism, a person who had the grievances, the resentments, let's say the latent willingness to do violence, and so on, in order for them to channel those vulnerabilities into political violence and extremist hate, there was really a kind of a process and a lot of good luck or bad luck, however you want to look on it, that went into it. They would have to go to a gun show and find that table that had that literature at it. And they would have to strike up a conversation with the guy at that table who might or might not invite them, to a meeting next week. Or they would have to be on the street and get recruited into a skinhead gang and go to a concert. And basically there was a much more gradual and channeled process of radicalization prior to digital communication technology. And that's also why the ideologies were more consistent, and also why the groups were more coherent. They tended to have a more pyramid type organizational structure with leadership and then the rank and file at the bottom. Well, with the internet, that's not how it works. A person who has those grievances, that willingness to do violence, who's looking for the scapegoat, they will encounter extremist propaganda. They will encounter the messages of folks who want to take those vulnerabilities and channel them towards an extremist political project simply by logging online. You can't avoid it. I think probably every single person, certainly we here on the panel and all 96 participants, I'm sure in the last week, you've probably seen something online that was pretty egregious. A person can very easily encounter that, but then they don't have to keep going down that particular path. They don't have to seek out the source of that particularly egregious bit of propaganda. They can just take that propaganda, they can right-click it and save it, or they can download the PDF, and then they can move on to the next thing. And so there's this kind of hopfrogging that creates this sort of mosaic of radicalization and ideologies and cultural signifiers and things like that, that's making the radicalization processes look very bespoke and unique and kind of idiosyncratic, depending on each individual. So then this affects the way that violence gets operationalized. And, since we're talking about January 6th, I'm sure we'll get into this more. But that was one of the big things with January 6th, is that you saw a lot of individuals who didn't necessarily share entirely the same political project or the same values, but they could coalesce around a time and a location and a general goal. And they could work together to try to achieve that goal through violence, even though they didn't have, some of them didn't have a formal leadership structure. Others were a little more traditional. I won't get bogged down in the weeds with that.
So it's interesting you're mentioning kind of the digital landscape here, Brian, and I'm glad that you segued a bit to January 6th, because the purpose of this roundtable was, I think we were originally meant to do it right after January 6th of this year I don't want to say anniversary, but let's say a marker a year after the fact to discuss it. So it's known now that these digital tools that are available for communication for the individuals who took part in the January 6th insurrection attack, they use these tools not just for radicalization purposes, for ideology transfer, but it was used for coordination. It was used to actually plan the attack. So I'm interested, beyond just the utility of the internet and of these internet tools for facilitating these attacks, and more of a grander look at everything. What do you think that attack, specifically the attack, what do you think it's done for the far right in the years since it occurred? Because we keep referring back to it, and the media refers back to it, and it's clearly it's an inflection point in the way that kind of the layperson perceives political conflict in the U.S. I don't want to say it was as big an event as something like September 11th, because that kind of brought terrorism to the fore for the United States on a grand scale. But I think January 6th opened a lot of eyes to people about where the threats lie in the US. So I'm curious as to, beyond just the impression that January 6th had on the American population, researchers, experts, what do you think that's done for the far right more generally in the years since?
Well, I can say a couple things about this. I mean, one thing that I think is important to note is that only about 16-17%, depending on where we are in terms of arrests, but of the people who've been arrested so far, about 16 or 17% of those people had any kind of prior ties to or affiliations with extremist groups. So we have this sort of strange, and then even those extremist groups, we've never seen that kind of gathering with with groups of people that normally would not have any kind of shared objective. QAnon, Proud Boys, white supremacists, extremists, the unlawful militias coming together. Now, of course, they had tried to do that before, right? Some of them, not all of those groups, but the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was really an attempt to bring together under one umbrella a couple of dozen white supremacist groups at least. My view of that has always been that they failed. I know that obviously they were able to come together on that day, and awful violence did happen and somebody died. but afterward, they were just as fragmented as ever. And a year later, when there was the Unite the Right 2 rally here in DC, only about 20 people showed up. I think they were outnumbered by journalists, and it kind of just fell apart. But then on January 6th, you saw that without an explicit call to unite, you could actually bring together all these disparate groups across the far right on what is called the lowest, what I often call the lowest common denominator, the thing that they do agree on, which again, I think is the same thing we're seeing in Ottawa right now. So I think we're seeing the kind of repeated, bringing together of people. There's swastika flags being waved in Ottawa. There's white supremacist symbols. There's been, all kinds of things, but that had nothing to do with what the original protests were about, which is a really specific vaccine mandate for truckers who are crossing the border, right? Like a narrowly defined professional group of people, an occupational mandate we're protesting. And then this has just been seized upon by others. So I think we're seeing the same kind of thing that people, and then the vast majority of people at January 6th who were ordinary Trump voters who were spontaneously mobilized to violence that day. So a couple of different things out of that. One, organizers in that small percentage of people who were strategically coordinating and conspiring to commit violence that day, they've learned that they can mobilize people, thousands of them even, quite spontaneously to violence in ways that can really provide a backdrop to terrorist activities and to activities that can cause tremendous harm or could have caused even greater harm had they been successful on that day. But they've also, I think, learned that you don't have to get people to agree on everything. You can actually mobilize them on just some single piece of disinformation or some single kind of idea that's anti-government in nature, like against a mandate, and you can mobilize a bigger group of people that way. So those are the kinds of things that I think will stick from January 6th, that we're already seeing lessons reverberate across the world, not just in the US.
Yeah, I think that puts it really, really well. January 6th, we struggle to find an analogy. I think you're right, Kurt, that 9/11 puts it a little bit too strongly. Sometimes I say it's sort of like the far right's spring of 1968. It's sort of a very utopic or dystopic view of what they hope that they can accomplish. It's a rallying point and a point of inspiration. It also serves as kind of a shibboleth that the party line, so to speak, on what January 6th was and wasn't helps to identify a person as either within this movement or outside this movement. And this is one of those lowest common denominator features that can bring folks together who otherwise might be ideologically pretty disparate. We talk about the variety of groups that were represented at January 6th and how there was, spontaneous action, and actually there is some evidence potentially that there might have been a little bit more coordinated action. There's a recent story in Reuters about members of the Oath Keepers and members of the Proud Boys having a hush-hush meeting in a DC parking garage. And, nothing says innocent get together like a meeting in a DC parking garage. So irrespective of whatever that coordination is, and the ad hoc, sort of almost flash mob character of the January 6th attack itself, we should also think about the diversity within these groups. The ideological differences that are able to cohere even within some of these movements within movements. The Boogaloo Boys were represented at January 6th. The Boogaloo movement is an excellent example of how individuals and then cell type groups that have differing political ideologies and maybe very different long-term goals can come together around the shared vision of a sort of spectacular act of violence or campaign of violence that they can all use for their own ends in this sort of larger plan to get them where they want to go. in the Boogaloo movement, you see people who are more associated with what we would kind of think of as traditional unlawful militias. You also see people with right-wing or national anarchist ideologies. You see people with the classic salad bar of incoherent beliefs and values, but that all kind of point in this one direction towards wanting to see the United States as it exists and our government as it exists toppled, for whatever goal. So it's not just the groups coming together, it's the people coming together within the groups too, that we need to be looking at.
This actually segues to a couple of questions that I want to bring in here, both from Lily that I think are relevant here. Lily asked early on the influence of the larger, what is the influence of the larger ethnopluralist movements such as IEM and the European far right affecting US domestic extremism? I think that speaks to the fact that the Venn diagram that illustrates the far right, it's not just overlapping circles with respect to ideology and certain belief structures, it's also overlapping circles with respect to geography. Coordination between groups geographically, I think that's nothing new. We've seen that occur. I mean, if we can say in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of groups that would be considered far left, they were coordinating across country borders. We see the same thing with the Islamist movements in the Middle East in the 90s, 2000s and forward. So I think that the influence, it's symbiotic. It goes back and forth. As I think one of the big implications of the Ottawa truck rally, and Cynthia mentioned this a bit, is that given what's happened and given what I think some are describing as a relative failure to police that properly, it's giving a model to others on what they can do and what they can get away with. That's one of the big dangers, I think. I also want to take a bit of a positive spin on this, because the question was what did January 6th do? And I think we're all in agreement that nothing terribly good in terms of what the threat the far right poses to the US domestic security. But Lily asked another question about the federal response to domestic extremism. And I think, if nothing else, what happened January 6th, I mentioned kind of in passing, it opened a lot of eyes. And I don't just mean that with respect to somebody on the street. I think that many individuals in the security apparatus in the US, the local, regional, and federal level, all kind of, for lack of a better term, it was a coming to God moment. They realized that this is a bigger threat than maybe they had considered. Some academics have been shouting about it for a while, but January 6th showed it in living color what the threat actually was and the risk that was posed by ignoring it. Another question that I have, and this is kind of my favorite pet idea right now, because I'm working on the role of the legal in the acceleration of what we've been calling far right ideals and far right behaviors. A good example, building off of this discussion related to January 6th, just the other day, the Republican National Committee called it, quote, legitimate political discourse. And they're trying to backtrack now. There were I think it was Ronna McDaniel came out and said that that's not what they meant, and they're doing a lot of backpedaling. My research now focuses on what are the implications of these kind of statements. So I'd be curious to hear from both of you as to what does that signal to people who would be planning a second January 6th? What are the implications of basically transmitting to everybody that this is seen as, quote, legitimate political discourse?
Yeah, I think that whether it's those exact words and they dial them back or not, I think there's tremendous danger in, we've seen kind of repeated attempts to downplay it, essentially, and a real partisan split about the meaning of January 6th. And we've heard language like it was just basically a group of tourists, and we've heard language that they, basically downplaying it as if it wasn't that bad. These were mostly people just walking around like they were the day visiting the Capitol. When we know, people died and people were, it was obviously we've seen those images, right? I mean, the breaking of windows and the violent, the wielding of fire extinguishers and flagpoles and the beatings. So I think there are a couple different things. One, I worry a lot about the rising willingness to use political violence that we see in polling data across the spectrum, and the increasing what we call moral disengagement in the field, which is, and again, across the spectrum, both sides across the political spectrum, we're seeing it. The numbers are higher on the right, but moral disengagement is the seeing the other as evil, as actually seeing them as evil. So the other political party is evil. It's a dehumanizing kind of thing, and it leads to it can facilitate political violence, because if you see the other as not human, as subhuman, that it makes it that much easier to leap to violence. And so those, I worry about that kind of feeding into this rhetoric, this continuing polarization, the continuing partisan divides, the inability to see history, see the world in the same way, or to agree on, even if we disagree on narratives, to just agree to respect some of those differences. How even something that to me seems like we've got the video evidence, like this was not just.
I was going to say that begs the question: should we respect when individuals? I mean, I hate to be so cliche, but the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. When there's video evidence of these things, should we respect that when people are telling us those sort of things? When it's blatant?
I don't know how we can, but we've had hearings. We've had hearings with the Capitol Police officers who, use the language of domestic terrorism and domestic extremism in those hearings. And then we have language that's just used in completely different ways. So yeah, I think that it's really dangerous to have that kind of to have a kind of whitewashing of the long ago past, but also the immediate past, right, when we've got the video evidence. So I don't know, Brian, if you have anything.
Yeah, well, this is why it's important to come at this work with a positive value, with a sense of a positive value that you're working toward, and why reactive approaches to this work end up kind of fighting this rear guard battle, because the first book of Cynthia's that I read, it wasn't her first book, was called The Extreme Gone Mainstream. And it was about how extremist groups were using mainstream marketing and branding techniques. That's a very crude way of describing it, but that was part of what it was about. And since then, we've come to say, no, actually, well, now, in addition to that, the mainstream has gone extreme. Because there's this increased rhetoric of moral disengagement, and because there's this increased explicit willingness to tolerate political violence that's committed by one's supporters. This isn't just a question of calling January 6th legitimate protest. There was also former President Trump's speech where, in all the talk, he dropped some language about pardoning people who were convicted of offenses on January 6th. Rhetoric like that is anti-democratic. And so simply by virtue of the fact that the people promulgating that rhetoric might achieve power and might be able to, institute their plan through the mechanisms of our legal and institutional norms, that doesn't make it acceptable. We have to stand for something beyond proceduralism, and a real radical commitment to democracy as the non-negotiable. I think is the foundational baseline to that.
And that leads to, Brian, you're setting me up perfectly for all these questions here. But there were a couple other questions I wanted to ask, but there are a lot of good questions going in the Q&A. So I really just want to pose one more question to both of you, and I'm not sure what the answer is. We've talked about it a little bit here about kind of what things are going to look like moving forward, given what we've seen in the last year since January 6th, and we've seen physical threats, the use of democratic institutions to undermine democracy itself, strangely enough.
Yeah.
what do you see as the biggest threat to American democracy in the next year, and then let's say in the next 5 years? Because in the next year, we can take kind of current trends and have an idea about which direction it's going to go. If I were a betting man, I'd bet that we're going to see what's happened in the last year turned up to 11, but beyond that, it becomes a bit fuzzier. What do you see, or what are you worried about in the next year, in the next 5 years regarding American democracy and the threats facing it?
Okay, I'm going to say some kind of alarmist stuff. So I want to promise the audience that after this, I'm going to talk about the hopeful, optimistic interventions, because that's where we spend our days. And I do think there's a lot to be said. And I see a question in the Q&A about what can be done. And I feel like we can leave people with a lot of like overwhelming fear of and not hope. But I try not to be too alarmist, but I do want to say a couple of things that I am worried about. But then I promise I want to focus a little bit too on what can be done and what do we know about what works. So there are two things I'm really worried about. One is spontaneous violence. And I think we're already seeing that we just are getting lucky. And I don't like that feeling of getting lucky when 22,000 armed protesters show up in Richmond in January 2020 to protest supposed, a lot of disinformation about they thought the National Guard was going door to door to take your guns and, all kinds of things that were informing them incorrectly about threats to Second Amendment rights. There were some things on the table that were being proposed by the legislation too, but that I feel like we got really lucky there. 22,000 heavily armed people and nothing terrible happened. January 6th, we didn't get so lucky, but in some ways we got, it could have been much worse. We all know it could have been much worse. And I think we're seeing these kind of spontaneous protests where people come together knowing that we're a country so heavily armed, and where extremist groups and individuals who really are within the organized, mobilized, extreme fringe are using those as an opportunity potentially to wreak havoc or to take advantage, as we saw with some of the Boogaloo Boys during the Black Lives Matter protests. That's what I kind of worry about that spontaneous combination and the ability of extremist groups to be opportunistic about it. The second thing I'm worried about is youth. I mean, we saw this with the HBCU bomb threats, which again, we still haven't gotten any more information about this, but the persons of interest identified in that case are teenagers. And, horrific bomb threats, terrorizing entire communities of vulnerable targeted individuals repeatedly. And these are real young people who are ostensibly distributed across the country, one of whom identified himself as affiliated with or a member of a very extreme white supremacist group. I do worry about how much time kids are spending online, youth are spending online during this pandemic, knowing how much propaganda and extremist content is circulating. And so I do think that it's not just to paint the whole internet as like the big bad, wolf, but I think our lack of digital media literacy work with teenagers in particular, we have done a much better job at teaching fifth graders now in digital communications classes how to recognize a predator online or how to be a good citizen and not cyberbully, protect their privacy, but we really don't give them very much about what propaganda looks like or what persuasive, what any kind of disinformation looks like, not enough anyway. So those are the things I'm really worried about right now. I think we are, not out of the woods.
Yeah, I mean, because extremism is so increasingly eclectic, when I think about the future domestic terror threats, where I go is the ambient conditions, the sort of the things that are ratcheting up this pressure cooker. So we have to look at deteriorating social conditions, the sense that people have that government is unresponsive to their needs. We need to look at environmental pressures. I think that climate change and all of the associated ills that surround it we know that these are massive contributing factors to the rise of extremism and the rise of extremist violence. COVID-19 exists in large part because of human incursion into the habitats of animals whose natural flora and fauna we don't have adequate immunity to. COVID-19 is only the first of pandemics to come. And when you throw on top of that catastrophic weather events, which are increasing, and who knows, water issues and so on and so forth, these are going to produce massive pressures that will lead people to seek out answers and to seek out easy answers, to look for scapegoats, to look for enemies. And if there's a sense that our government is unresponsive, those easy answers and those violent answers are going to look all the more attractive. Again, this isn't just an issue of dealing with this or that attack before it occurs, tapping this phone or that phone or getting an informant in this group or that group. It's really about lowering the temperature, unratcheting the pressure cooker, making our world seem more sustainable and hopeful, making it seem like there actually could be a future so that people don't feel as if they're going to have, their entitlements taken away from them. But as I say that, when we talk about this sense of entitlement, there are legitimate entitlements and then there are illegitimate entitlements. Again, because I'm coming at this from a perspective of having values that we try to put into action, we could say that legitimate entitlements are people are entitled to a decent living if they're willing to work for it. They're entitled to the expectation that the world will be around for their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, and so on and so on. People are entitled to the sense that they have some small measure of control over the way that they're governed. What people aren't entitled to is a privileged position within a social hierarchy based on accidents of birth, like race, gender, and so on and so on. So at the same time that we need to ensure that people have these legitimate entitlements met, we also have to work to dismantle the expectation of these illegitimate entitlements. So understanding the history of white supremacy, its legacy, and its ongoing implementation in our contemporary American society is the classic and the central example: misogyny and male supremacy. Understanding how these supremacist hierarchies get woven into the invisible fabric of our everyday lives is actually key as well. And to the extent that we ignore that, and to the extent that we capitulate to people who want to intimidate us out of facing those issues, that also serves to ratchet up that pressure cooker that in the end leads to more terror incidents and a more extremist ambience just in society as a whole.
Okay, so we're all going to die, is what it comes down to.
No.
There is going to be an opportunity here in some of these questions that ask about what we can really do, and we're going to get to those. But I do want to. We have a bevy of questions already, so if it's cool with you, Brian, and you, Cynthia, I'd like to move into the questions here, because there are some really good ones here, and a lot of them that I think are that they highlight some of the really sensitive topics that we have to discuss when we talk about what constitutes an extremist act and what's extremism versus not. Linda's question relates to an event like a book burning. How does that fall into like our taxonomy of extremism? She specifically says, do you categorize it as a violent act? And if it was led by a person of a certain ideology, would you consider it a terror threat? So this is where lines drawn around actions and what we call operational definitions are really important. I myself would not call a book burning a violent act as long as the person owns the book. It's their own property. If they were to throw a firebomb into a bookstore and to say like a Christian bookstore or a Jewish bookstore, yes, I'd call that a violent act. But I'm also notoriously, I have much more notorious operational boundaries around what I consider to be violence versus nonviolence. But that's just a function of getting emails from people all over the place that are yelling at me. So I'm very sensitive to that. But I'm curious as to what you two think about something like a book burning.
So
Well, I think
about you go, Brian. You go first.
I think that, a book burning per se might not necessarily be violent. Where the violence might come in, as you say, a person who burns their own book in their own backyard, can't be said to be committing an act of violence. But where the violence might come in then is in the capturing of that act and the communication of that act. So if I, if someone, not me, were to obtain a Quran or a stack of Qurans and burn them and film it and then send the film to all the mosques in their town, I think that is an act of violence. The physiological response of people who are subject to those kinds of threats is negative. There is a negative deleterious effect on the health, both mental and physical, of the people who encounter those kinds of threats. So I take maybe a slightly broader definition of violence than maybe some folks would, but we know that people who are subject to ongoing stresses and a sense of threat as to their own safety and well-being have an increased rate of heart disease, cancer, stroke, to say nothing of anxiety, depression, and all the mental health problems that go along with it. So I think that when it's used to communicate something like a threat, then it does cross the line into violence.
I was going to say something very similar is whether or not the burning of books itself could be considered violent. I think for me, the bigger question is it a threat of potential further violence, which starts to approximate the kind of intimidation or coercion or threatening of civilians that we do talk about as part of the definition of domestic extremism or even domestic terrorism. So it would depend to me on what's being burned, right? Those images in Tennessee were troubling and haunting, and because of their similarities with the imagery that we saw from 1933. But those were book burnings that were organized by a regime, right? The burning of Jewish intellectuals' books and writings, that was a clear threat. If you were seeing, and if we are seeing, the burnings, collective burnings of books by groups of people, let's say all the LGBTQ books, themed books related from that are in a library in a school, that to me would be a threat, as a threat that we don't believe this deserves to be in existence, or threats, targeting books about race, targeting books about gender equality, right? Like whatever it is, if it's a topic that's targeting a group of people, and that is expressing then a form of superiority about what knowledge should be on a library shelf or what knowledge should be taught, then I think we start, does it meet the definition or not? It's troubling for communities. It's troubling for families. It's certainly harassing and distressing and toxic for targeted group members. And so I think we have to think about it, not so much with the sort of hats about does this meet the definition of terrorism or extremism, but we should be intervening in those kinds of things because we don't want them to happen for the health of our communities and for the people who feel and are targeted by them.
All right, there's another series of questions here that, again, right in kind of my wheelhouse right now, where there's concern over the rise of populism in the US, especially on the right, and the platforming of right-wing populist leaders, not just so they can espouse rhetoric, but actually running for office and actually gaining power. They're not necessarily populists, but I think I saw somewhere that in the upcoming midterm elections, there's upwards of 100 people who are running for office that are considered far right, or at least approaching populism. Not to say anything about the QAnon types that are running for office as well. There are a couple of questions that ask, how concerned should we be about this trend? And if it is an ongoing trend, how do we deal with these kinds of leaders who are not just espousing this rhetoric, but some that have been found to be coordinating with those who have less than democratic ideals?
I think this is something that you have to look at on a case-by-case basis. I don't know if this gets at the heart of the question, but maybe it does give an opportunity for us to be a little optimistic here. Political demagogues, people who use the mechanisms of democracy toward anti-democratic ends. These were not invented in 2015. This goes back all the way to the founding of the United States and before. These are issues that we've always dealt with. We go through periods where it's worse than in other periods, and then there are those external factors that can make it worse yet. And then you have things like ample access to firearms, which can make it worse yet. But what goes along with that is also a legacy of coalition building against it. So for as long as all these problems have been around, there have also been coalitions built between across the divides of race, religion, gender, you name it, to oppose this and to work towards a truly democratic and truly inclusive society. So, populism appears as a symptom of underlying pathologies that are just always there in American society. But the remedy is also always there in American society. And it's really a matter of developing those coalitions in a way that's going to effectively oppose this rising tide of populist, anti-democratic politicians.
Kurt, can you restate the question really quickly? I was confess writing to a grad student in the chat in the Q&A responding to her question. So then I was hearing it, but I obviously can't multitask quite as well.
I saw the I didn't want to put your email in the chat, and I figured I'd let you answer. The question basically is that we're seeing this rise in populism, especially among the right wing, and not just at the federal level, but at the regional and the local level as well, to the point that they're putting up populist leaders who don't just engage in rhetoric that's populist in kind and kind of plays footsie with extremist ideas, but they've also been found to have coordinated with individuals who are like unmistakably on the far right. What is the best way to contend with that? Especially with respect to the use of disinformation and things of that nature. And the reason I bring up disinformation, not only because it was in one of the questions, but somebody also asked very simply, basically, like, what do we do about this to deal with these sorts of problems and these ideologies being spread, not just among populists, but among others? And I think this is where you can talk a bit about kind of the interventions we work on.
Yeah. So I'll try to touch on the populism issue and then pivot into the interventions. I mean, so, there's a lot that I say about this issue of populism, but one thing I will say that, when you look at the sort of thin definition of populism that Cass Mudde uses, which I think is a really useful one, which is really that it is kind of a rhetorical tactic or a framing strategy that pits the pure people against a bad or nefarious elite. And, the elite are corrupt, the people are pure, and the elite, and this person comes in who's gonna, resist the bad elite and save the pure people. And that's kind of like a rhetorical frame or strategy that you often see. And we see it in a lot of US kind of rhetoric around, the coastal elites looking down on the middle of the country, or there being flyover country, or, just grievances that result from people feeling looked down upon and discarded or disregarded. And then how that plays into a lot of the propaganda that's used by the right that says something's being taken away from you and that elites are taken away from you. Then it feeds into conspiracy theories, of course, too, about what elites and which elites are doing it and for what purposes, because they want to get more power. So all these things start to intersect, but I think, some of it is about helping people recognize there is a scaffold to conspiracy theories, there's a scaffold to populism, there are sort of real clear tactics and frameworks and almost like a roadmap that once people see it, it helps them identify it. And we know that from your work in inoculation and the work that we've been doing together that we can talk about. But I also think it's, you have to also kind of recognize that for example, there's really good research out there showing like only 7% of the people arrested so far for criminal acts at the Capitol on January 6th were unemployed, right? I mean, these are not people who are the most disenfranchised, who have grievances. It's people who feel they have something to lose, right? And so, we've seen research, for example, that shows that you're not more likely to join the far right if you're unemployed, but you are more likely to join the far right if you grew up in a household with an unemployed parent. So that is a feeling, an emotional state of what I call precariousness, which is an emotional state that makes you feel or become more vulnerable to rhetoric that says something could be stolen from you, whether that's a white majority country or Second Amendment rights or an election that is purportedly illegitimate, that propaganda that comes along and says something's going to be taken away from you, that people are vulnerable to that. So there was some Washington Post analysis shortly after January 6th that showed that a surprising number of people, even though they weren't actually unemployed, they were middle class businessmen, somebody flew in on a private jet, et cetera. At January 6th, a lot of these people were quite stable, but disproportionately they had experienced a high number of bankruptcies and tax liens and evictions in their life, sometimes dating all the way back to childhood. So I would put that in the same. So the journalist was asking me based on that analysis, so is this really economic insecurity? I was trying to explain the difference between actual economic insecurity and this feeling of precariousness, right? That emotional state that people might have experienced prior in their life that might make them more vulnerable to that propaganda that says something's going to be stolen from them. So that gets at this issue of populism, but also gets at the issue of when you're thinking about interventions, and maybe I'll let Brian just say a little bit about our inoculation work. We have
what I'm going to do, Cynthia, I'm going to build off your answer and then start posing questions about the inoculation work back and forth to you.
All right, you want me to stop?
I just want to maximize our time here because we have a bunch of good questions here, and I want to make sure I get the right
so
person.
Let me stop then, and you jump right in, and we'll move into intervention.
Yeah, and I'm planting my moderator flag. No, one of the questions that kind of segues right out of what you were saying comes from Briarigio, who asks, basically, we talked a lot about kind of how the internet's used to facilitate radicalization, how extremists can use it, but how can it be used positively? I think Brian can talk about this since the internet is his jam, but I mean, we've been running some experiments and looking into how the internet can be used ideally to fight these kinds of things. Brian, you want to speak to some of that stuff, not just specifically regarding some of the stuff we'd be doing at PERIL, but more generally too?
Sure, I'd love to. We actually, building on a lot of your work, Kurt, do interventions based on this idea of attitudinal inoculation. And what attitudinal inoculation proposes, basically, is that if you can reach people who have not yet really committed to an undesirable set of beliefs, and if you can alert them to the manipulative rhetorics and narratives that might lead them to take on those undesirable beliefs, they become better able to resist it. It's sort of the same, it works by the analogy of an actual inoculation, where you introduce a weakened version of a virus to your body so that when your body encounters the real virus in the world, it's better able to fight it off. So, to build off of what Cynthia said, with this, these populist rhetorics, the people who are absorbing these populist talking points have not necessarily been to Washington, D.C. and stood on a corner while, a guy in a blue suit with a red tie points at them and laughs and says, ha ha, look at that yokel. That, what's happening is that they're absorbing messages that are telling them that people are looking down on them. And so that's where the hostility is really coming from. So if in theory you can reach someone to say, listen, I'm not telling you what to believe, and maybe people in New York are super duper annoying, but if you're just listening to the radio and someone comes on to tell you that there's this entire class of people who look down on you and sneer at you, just really think about what that person is trying to get you to believe in addition to that. Well, they're more likely to see that kind of rhetoric as a red flag in the future, and they're more likely to react to it and respond to it with counter arguments and with trying to poke holes in it rather than accepting it and adopting it as part of their worldview in a way that then can motivate them towards further undesirable points of view.
In a more general sense, we have a couple of questions as to like the motivating factors that contribute to people kind of seeking out not just populist leaders and populist ideologies, but kind of any of these ideologies we see on what we've been calling the far right. Arlene talks about moral disengagement, the threat that poses to elections at all levels. I think I saw another question in here about kind of grievances that people have and how they contribute to individuals engaging in these kinds of activities. So I think the question really is, what is the role of these different kinds of factors in promoting far-right extremism in the US? Are they major roles? And do we think that they should be combated, or is it better to combat the ideology itself? And I'm going to give that to Cynthia.
Yeah, so I usually talk about this as a combination, the things that create conditions under which extremist ideas become more attractive to people are a combination of kind of structural and system level grievances. That can be anything. Right now, there's a lot of COVID related mandates, kind of things that I would say are grievances. And then individual level vulnerabilities, it's more like school shootings, when we think of like that there's no formula, but there's a lot of things that go into the pot that we know exist. So sometimes individual level trauma, but not always. So childhood trauma, sometimes, often I would say even social isolation in some kind, but not always. Like they're often quite well networked online, but socially isolated in person from others. The positive side of things, we find people, especially young people, are attracted to a sense of belonging, a sense of brotherhood, a sense of contributing to something that has a purpose that's bigger and better than themselves. They often are attracted to the language of heroism, of saving something, whether that's a caliphate, restoring a caliphate, or restoring a white ethno-state, or creating a white ethno-state, defending the Constitution, defense language, protection language, right? So all of those kinds of things, especially for young men, there's a lot of masculinity stuff, being a real man, being a national man, all that kind of language that I've analyzed in the past in propaganda as well. So there's no clear, this leads to this, but you can see the same kind of toxic mix. And the last thing I'll say, because it relates to another question that is in there, especially for young people, one of the things we've seen over the last, especially I'd say decade, is that the far right itself has weaponized youth culture and positioned itself as counterculture to the mainstream. So they have been positioning themselves as the provocative, edgy, what they call sometimes the meme-based insurrection, or meme wars, that they're the provocative, edgy ones, and everyone else is just a triggered snowflake who can't take a joke. That both creates a ton of plausible deniability by using so much humor and irony and satire and wit in the memes and in the jokes to express things like scientific racism or Holocaust denialism. But it also, it makes them the ones that are, edgy and countercultural. So, some of the successful stuff that I've seen sometimes tries to flip that script, right? So can you, instead of fighting them in the streets at a neo-Nazi protest in Germany, some people turned it into a walkathon fundraiser and, raised donations for every mile they walked, and then stood alongside with signs saying, thanks, you've raised 10,000 euros for anti-racist groups in this town. Thanks, you've raised 20,000 euros. And they really did actually raise like a couple €100,000. And at the same time, kind of befuddled these neo-Nazis who were like, oh, do I keep walking or not? Like, I'm raising money for, these anti-racist groups. So, I think that's the kind of creative energy, some of what we need. But Brian and Kurt can talk more about some of the creative stuff we're actually doing.
Yeah, so I'll touch on that very quickly. Like Brian has mentioned some of the inoculation work that we've been doing, and in terms of what's been effective, I think we've been finding, generally speaking, and Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Of course, there's nuances here, that inoculation seems to work in terms of getting people to become more critical of the message they're exposed to. A lot of the work that we're doing at PERIL now surrounding inoculation, it comes from an original study I did in 2017 or 2018, where it's useful because it didn't just focus, that original study didn't just focus on the far right, it focused on far left ideology as well, and it worked there too. So what we often see with respect to violent extremism and terrorism over history is you see that ideologies wax and wane. So it's if history repeats itself, sometime in the next 50 or 60 years, we'll have a wave of far left terrorism that we'll need to address, or some other kind of ideological terrorism. And if the research is any indication, inoculation should work for those as well. The benefit of it is that it's like atheistic in that way. Which also it alludes to a question Dale asks about whether or not radicalization of those who get radicalized to the far right, is it in response to what we see coming from the far left or from progressives, or is there radicalization a backlash due to the so-called deplorables? And I think this gets, and you can both comment if you like. I'm going to again use my moderator authority to comment very quickly. I think there's a phenomenon that's studied. I think it's called symbiotic radicalization, or I can't remember.
Reciprocal radicalization.
Reciprocal, yeah. Some people call it reciprocal radicalization. To me, that it occurs sometimes as one group becomes more extreme, the other group has to become more extreme in response. I often think that when some of the stuff I've read about it, I think there's some viability to it, but I also think it's just both sidesing the radicalization issue. In terms of what the far, if we're looking at response to left-wing policies or left-wing rhetoric surrounding the right, if we just look at the data as to the threat that the far right poses to domestic security relative to what the far left has done in the last 5 or 10 years, I think saying that the far left causing the far right as if they had to do this as a form of reciprocal radicalization, I would say that that's probably unlikely. There's something else going on here that's motivating the far right, because we would expect that as one group decides to radicalize and engage in increasingly violent activities, the other one will reciprocally about the same amount. But that's not what we're seeing at all. It would be a stretch to say that being called deplorables or the amount of violence we've seen from the left in the last 5 years would yield by itself what we're seeing from the right. There's something else going on. And I'll leave it to Cynthia and Brian.
Yeah, I would just jump in really fast to say where I think some of what maybe this is some of what Dale was saying too, is where we do see some kind of backlash to civil rights progress, backlash to social change. That's the kind of like the trigger, the backlash again, the countercultural against the triggered snowflakes who can't take a joke kind of thing, like making fun of content warnings or trigger warnings in college. So there's a lot of propaganda and kind of like trolling stuff circulating about college, about higher ed, about college campuses, about pronoun usage, let's say, or shifts, transgender stuff. So there is definitely kind of backlash against that. That I wouldn't say is a primary driver, but it's a kind of a climate thing that, just like the deplorables too, this kind of the way that might contribute to some of that like anti-elite stuff. So it's part of that same toxic mix, but I don't know, Brian might want to add there. We
also see really quickly, Brian, before I let you jump in, we also see, over the course of history, when we look at radicalization processes, and we know this from interviewing actual people who left terrorism or even active terrorists, that a lot of the things that are being pointed at, like what Cynthia just mentioned, they're often used as kind of retroactive excuses as to why people decided to engage in activity. So a lot of people they'll adopt some relatively disgusting ideas that advocate violence, and then after they're either called on it or arrested for engaging in violence, they'll blame something else. They'll look at something else and say that's the reason why. So sorry, Brian, you go ahead.
No, I think that you both, pretty much summed it up. I'll just add that the deplorables talking point is a really good example of how mediatized a lot of this rhetoric that can kind of prompt this increasingly stark polarization is. If you go back and you read the transcripts or listen to the deplorables speech that Hillary Clinton gave, she didn't call all conservatives deplorables. I mean, the speech identified a very narrow minority of Donald Trump supporters as the basket of deplorables. And then it wasn't as though, the Democratic National Committee invested millions of dollars in a publicity campaign to call people deplorable. What happened was that this badly constructed speech was seized upon and manipulated to create a narrative that Hillary Clinton had called every conservative and every salt of the earth, heartland American deplorable. That wasn't the case. What you had was a very loud, vocal, and coordinated right-wing media machine presenting this pseudo version of the events as they actually occurred. And that contributed certainly to the polarization. Now, you can criticize Hillary Clinton for providing the raw materials that enabled that propaganda blitz to be deployed. But it was the propaganda blitz that really created the polarization.
Now, unfortunately, with that, we have to stop there because we're going to get kicked off our webinar here pretty soon. We still have 10 open questions, I know. But what I'm going to offer, I'm not going to offer it for Cynthia and Brian. My email is pretty easy to find. If you have more questions you want to ask, you are welcome to email me. I'm not going to put it in as my name because I don't want those who may hate me now to have ready access to my email. You're really going to work for it. But if you do want to ask any further questions, you're welcome to shoot me an email. Brian and Cynthia, would you offer that, or would you like it?
Yeah, I would say our email is the best email for us is peril@american.edu. You can reach us, any of us there, actually, if you just signal who it is, that we can, anyone who's a fellow or a staff member can be reached that way. It's monitored by a team, and so that'll get to us. I would also just say that we have all of our, Carol, we didn't really talk about our community-based work, but we have a whole suite of resources for communities in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Those are all free, downloadable, available to the public. We have parents and caregivers guide. We have resources for educators, for mental health practitioners. We're doing one right now for coaches and other adults who work with youth in mentoring capacities. All of those are free, and we don't have a chat function here, but it's at www.splcenter, so at the SPL Center /PERIL. So it's on the Southern Poverty Law Center's website. You can also get the guides themselves on our website, but at the splcenter.org/PERIL site, there's impact studies. We'll tell you about we studied it with 750 parents to get evidence about how it works and does it better equip them. It does, really great findings. We have focus group data there, all kinds of stuff that you can find out about what works for communities to better equip them. And we'll be building that out at a much bigger scale over the next few years. So there should be a lot more coming on that site.
There we go. I hacked the system. I changed my name to the URL if you want to look those things up.
All right.
That's very cool.
That's the kind of education you'll get at the American
University. Yeah, that's what a PhD gets you after going to school for way too long to do way too little. Brian, do you have any closing remarks you want to make here?
No, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thanks for all the great questions. Thanks, Kurt, for hosting this and moderating it so well. Thanks to Dean Fullwood for the excellent introduction. Take care out there, everyone.
Yeah, thanks to everybody. And as I said, feel free to use that PERIL email address, because I think I can speak for Brian and Cynthia here in saying that one of our favorite things to do is engage with people who are interested in this, practitioners and even laypersons on the ground who maybe don't get they don't get to see this or experience this as often as we'd like. So please reach out with any questions you might have. We'll be glad to engage with you further. So thank you for spending a Tuesday night with us. I'm going to go play a hockey game. I think that I think Brian and Cynthia have their own plans. So, and thank you to SOC and SPA for allowing us to do this. This is very hugely appreciated.